We're Detroit Disability Power. We're a disability-focused organization here in Detroit. We have a little over 300 members, and we're really focused on dismantling systems of oppression and building political power among disabled Detroiters, and really disabled Michiganders. And we have an ultimate goal of making Detroit the most accessible city in America. And so the work we're doing here really is one piece of that work. You'll see here, there's a number of pictures on this screen of some of our work. Our danceability program, which is a part of our healing work. This particular event was at the DIA, so people got to dance in the art museum, which was awesome. We have another picture of several of our volunteers with Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who they happened to run into last year on Election Day at the Wayne State Law, where there's a polling location. And finally, the third picture is our community organizer, Najee, introducing our team at our, I think it was our 5th birthday party. And so, we're trying to do a lot in the community and be out there. And we're really, really thankful, for all of our supporters that we know are here today, along with all the elected officials, clerks, media, who are here to learn about the 2024 poll audit report. So today, our goals are to share the findings of the report, really let everybody know how we did the work, what our methodology was, share the recommendations we have for making improvements in general. We do know that every polling location is different, and clerks may have particular issues or concerns that may not be addressed specifically by our recommendations, and we're certainly happy to work with clerks on that, in the coming weeks, months, and years. And then, we certainly want to address any questions or concerns of everyone here. The agenda, it actually looks longer, I think, than it is, but we're going to provide some background through talking about the disability vote, the history and purpose of our audits, the legal framework that really is the driving force for this work, ensuring the rights of disabled people are protected, the methodologies we use, our findings, both during early voting and overall, looking a little bit at some of our breakdowns, including analysis by facility type and jurisdictions. And then we're going to talk about some of the challenges we know exist that we're working on policy advocacy to help address, because we know that there are some issues that aren't the fault of any election professional or clerk. It's really just the policy doesn't always work out, or the reality of the world doesn't work out. We have a number of recommendations, and then we're going to talk a little bit about kind of next steps and what can be done moving forward before we get into questions and other things. So kind of where we're going to start before I hand it over to other team members is just kind of the landscape that we're in of the disability vote. And we're really broken down into 2 areas. What does this look like nationally, and what does this look like in Michigan? Nationally, 1 in 4 adults in the United States has a disability. And this is estimated to be about 40 million eligible voters. If we look beyond just disabled eligible voters and look at their households and family members, we're actually talking about 65 million voters that are likely impacted by access at the polls, either because it directly impacts them or it impacts a family member that they may need to, support or assist in completing their vote. In Michigan, the numbers are a little bit close, but a little bit different. Nearly 1 in 3 voting age people in Michigan has a disability. And the area where we're primarily focused, though we are ever expanding, and we'll be leaving the Metro Detroit area, but Metro Detroit serves about 1 million Michiganders in their voting, which is about 10% of the state's population. So the access in this part of the state really does have a huge impact on a large percentage of the voters. And a lot of these issues are continuing to happen despite the fact that there already are legal protections in place. We still have these barriers. Finally, just some national research that has been done related to the work we're doing here. The GAO, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, when they've looked at polling sites, they found 17% of polling places nationwide have no potential impediments to voting. However, the number of sites they visited, and I don't recall the exact number off the top of my head, but it's actually smaller than the number of sites we visited last year nationally. And then the National Council on Disability conducted a survey and found only 20% of disabled voters were able to vote privately and independently, which is the baseline that the law requires. So we know that there's a huge issue here, and that's really what we're working to try to address through this work. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dessa.
Thanks so much, Eric. Hi again, everyone. This is Dessa. Just want to give you a little bit of history and explain the purpose of why we do these audits. And I'm actually going to kick it off with a really quick story about my own experience. Back in 2018, I was just starting Detroit Disability Power. I had recently moved, and so I was going to a new polling location. And I showed up in my wheelchair. I was able to get out of my car okay, get into the building okay. And I got my ballot, and then I turned around to see where I could vote. And there was literally nowhere that I could reach in my wheelchair. All of them were standing height booths. So I turned around to the election workers and I said, "Hey, cool, where can I vote?" And they looked perplexed. It was clear that they had not considered a wheelchair user coming in to vote. And then the person at the table moved her papers over where people sign in and said, "You can vote right here." And I said, "Well, thank you, but this is not private, and I am entitled to private voting like everyone else." She got a little bit cranky with me, but thankfully another poll worker stepped in and said, "Hold on one moment." And he cleared off a table across the room and I was able to vote. Um, Not the worst story in the world, not the end of the world. I was able to vote. My vote was counted. That's the most important thing. But what it really made very clear to me is that no one was prepared for me to show up. Here in Detroit, we have more than 80,000 voters with mobility disabilities, meaning that we should be prepared. Even if there was five of us, we should be prepared. But there are many voters with disabilities, as Eric just explained, and yet it doesn't seem like we are adequately prepared for so that we can have a smooth, independent, private voting experience. I actually have many other stories of my own and from friends and colleagues that I don't have time to share, but that's really what kicked off my obsession with accessible voting. I just so happened that night to have a board meeting for Detroit Disability Power, and I shared my frustration with my board members who were also all disabled people. And to my surprise, everyone else had a story too. So we had all these different disabilities, but we had all had challenges casting a ballot one or more times in our adult life. And so we partnered up with Warriors on Wheels and a couple of other organizations that year and started doing kind of anecdotal surveys of people's voting experiences. And then we shared those findings with local clerks. In 2022, we really took that up a notch by partnering with the Carter Center. We really made our survey tool far more sophisticated. We had a much more robust volunteer team on election day. And that year, we were able to audit 261 polling places. So rather than having disabled voters report on their experience voting, we actually had trained teams of auditors going out with challenger credentials and doing a thorough audit and then having a lot of really good data come back that the Carter Center helped us analyze. And we put out a report in 2023 about those 2022 audits. As you know, because you're here, we did it again in 2024. And this time we tweaked the survey tool a little bit to make it even more clear and sophisticated. We trained more people and we were able to get out to 294 polling places in 21 jurisdictions. So we're really making our process more sophisticated and we're also expanding our reach. At the same time, last year, we launched the National Polling Access Coalition, which is a group of national and local organizations, most of which are disability focused, but some are election protection and voting rights focused. And we created a whole bunch of materials for people so that they could do audits in their communities wherever they live in the United States. We trained hundreds of people. We made lots of free resources to teach people step by step how to design a sophisticated and accurate audit program. And so we have seen more people doing audits around the country. Next slide, please. So, as you might imagine, we're really interested in making sure that voting rights for all eligible disabled citizens are respected and upheld. We are a highly marginalized community already, and we have everything to gain from better access to the democratic process and making sure that our priorities are known by the people we elect in the proposals that we support. So we really need to have equal access to the ballot. And many people don't even know the challenges that we're facing, which is why we do this work and are hosting this briefing. We want to be really clear about what the barriers to equal access are. We evaluated things that are legally required. So there is a lot of room for improvement on the election administration side, on the infrastructure investment side, so that we can actually be fully in compliance with the law. And more importantly to me, make sure that our community is able to participate in the democratic process. So these audits help us monitor compliance and also provide an opportunity to have benchmarks so that we can compare data year to year. So now we have excellent data from 2022. We can compare it to the data that we collected in 2024. So also we have a constitutional right to be able to vote privately and independently. We can receive assistance from a person as long as they're not our employer or our union representative. And we are entitled both at the state and federal level for equitable access to voting. So this is what we're trying to achieve, and these audits are a way for us to learn and evaluate where we can do improvements. With that, I'm going to hand it over to our Voting Access and Election Protection Fellow, Kenya.
Thank you, Dessa. This is Kenya speaking. So as Dessa mentioned, this work is important for all of us. I am also a disabled voter. I'm a blind voter, and so I have encountered trouble with the voter assist terminals, also in another state trying to vote absentee. And so this work isn't just important, but it's so incredibly critical to all of us. And so I'm going to start by covering some of the legal protections that ensure that we are able to cast our ballot, but it's really the bare minimum. So from a federal perspective, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, specifically Section 201, prohibits literacy tests, which protect voters with cognitive disabilities. Section 208 allows disabled voters to receive assistance from a person of their choice as long as it's not their employer or union representative. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, specifically Title II, requires equal opportunity in all government programs, and that includes voting, and that applies to all aspects of voting and access to information as well. The Help America Vote Act of 2002 requires at least one accessible voting system at each polling place. And to clear up any confusion for those who may not be from Michigan, we refer to the accessible voting system as the VAT, the Voter Assist Terminal. And all systems must allow for private and independent voting for voters with disabilities. The Michigan-specific laws include MCL 168.662, and that extends the Voter Accessibility for Elderly and Handicapped Act and Help America Vote Act provisions to non-federal elections. MCL 168.795 requires accessible voting devices at each polling place. So now we're going to go into the methodology for poll observations, at least specifically what DDP does and what our approach looks like. So we conducted audits during the August 6th primary and November 5th general elections in 2024. Uh, we used observation teams to collect standardized accessibility data, and Eric and I specifically trained our volunteers on the questionnaire, everything that it was asking, and all the possible answers so that they felt prepared to conduct these assessments. We assessed compliance with established standards required by state and federal law. So what did our geographic coverage look like? So as Dessa mentioned earlier, we assessed 294 sites. That spanned 21 municipalities, 3 counties, 41 early voting sites. And as most of you may know, last year was the first year that Michigan had early voting. And so we wanted to make sure that we captured what polling locations looked like, especially because having access to early voting allows for greater flexibility for everyone, but that can be especially critical for disabled people who need to set up transportation, etc. So this represents the combined total number of sites during the August and November elections. What did our criteria look like? So observers used standardized questionnaires to evaluate whether there was accessible parking with a clear pathway into the building, an accessible entrance, a functional voter assist terminal that, and an accessible wheelchair height voting booth. And in order for a site to be considered fully accessible, the site had to meet all 4 criteria. I will now turn it back over to Eric.
Thank you, Kenya. So now, this is kind of in the background now to the actual findings, which is what, I think people are really here for. And so the big takeaway number is 13%. In our audits of those 294 locations, we found only 13% to be fully accessible. Now, the exact reason the site wasn't, accessible certainly varied. Some had problems in multiple areas. Some polling locations only perhaps had issues in one of the 4 criteria. But ultimately, since you have to pass in all 4 to actually be in compliance with the law, we do see this number. So there is, some room for improvement. But to talk about the data in a lot more detail than I can, I'm going to pass it over to Sarah to dig into the numbers.
Thank you. There we go. So yes, only this is Sarah. Only 13% of polling places were visited were fully accessible, and 87% of polling locations had at least one significant accessibility barrier. So this is similar to 2022's findings, which were 16% accessible, showing persistent challenges. Now, in terms of the difference between 13 and 16%, there could be several reasons for that. I looked at, there were more sites that were visited in 2024 than 2022. 294 sites in 2024 compared to 261. And whenever I looked at sites that were either new or changed from 2022, the accessibility of those sites was at 13%. And so it's about even with the overall level of accessibility with the entire number. When looking at sites, and we'll get into this, I believe, a little bit later, that were visited in 2022 as well as 2024, the accessibility dropped from 16% to 9%. So there was a drop among repeat sites. And again, this can be for several reasons. This certainly can be for changes in terms of accessibility. It also, though, can be related to changes in the observation. Another question was added between 2022 and 2024. observers had more practice evaluating accessibility barriers. So just in terms of why there is that difference there are several reasons and so a decrease in accessibility is one of them, but there's also changes to the methodology. The barriers that were present do prevent private and independent voting for people with disabilities. They can make it difficult or impossible to get into the polling place, to be able to navigate around the polling place, to be able to cast your ballot. And these issues persist despite long established legal requirements. The Americans with Disabilities Act is over 30 years old, but we know it wasn't a magic wand whenever this legislation was passed, and that these barriers exist not just for voting, but all throughout society in terms of access for people with disabilities. So we'll get into the legal requirements and how that broke down for different building types a little bit later on. But all polling places are required to be accessible, even if those buildings are not regularly do not regularly fall under Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Places like churches that are regularly exempt from accessibility requirements outside of election season are still required to be accessible for voters with disabilities. Next slide. So in terms of early voting, as Eric said, this is the first year for early voting for Michigan. And in terms of the August early voting, 41 sites were visited. Only 17% of early voting locations were fully accessible. But of those, 11 polling places only had one access barrier. And if these single barriers were corrected, 44% of polling places that were visited would be fully accessible. And so some of the specific early voting barriers that were noticed were 46% lacked accessible parking and pathways. 27% had inaccessible entrances. 49% had inaccessible voter assist terminals, and 29% lacked accessible voting booths. And I do want to draw I draw attention to that 49% had inaccessible voter assist terminals, because I think it's really important to think about things that are structural accessibility issues, like parking lots that are not accessible, not having ramps into buildings, things like that, that might be a little bit more difficult to fix because elections offices may not have the funding to be able to fix those or the authority to fix those. But then there are also accessibility barriers that are fully operational issues. So issues with the voter assist terminal not being set up properly. That is something that is completely related to poll worker training and how poll workers are taught to set up the voter assist terminals, how they are taught to work with people with disabilities, voters with disabilities in using those VATs. So that is something where half of the sites nearly had access barriers. And if poll worker training around using the voter assist terminal was changed, was improved, that's something that could be pretty much eliminated. And the same goes for setup of accessible voting booths. There are some similar barriers there with, making sure that those are set up in a way that is wheelchair height, private, and independent. So those are things that can be completely addressed through poll worker training versus inaccessible entrances, inaccessible parking and pathways, which are very important and still need to be addressed. But those might be a little bit more challenging, might take some more resources and sometimes creativity around how to deal with the access barriers that are present in the buildings that are being used. Next slide. So for election day findings, so these are looking at the 294 sites that were visited in August and November on election day. 54% of those polling places had issues with accessible parking and pathways. And I went through the data and I pulled out some examples. These numbers, there might be some more than this, but these were, as I counted certain instances of prevalent barriers. So 31 polling places were noted as having faded paint and or missing accessibility signs in the parking lot. So or if it's street parking, if there's accessible street parking, making sure that there's signs and lines that are well marked there as well. So that is just, the accessible parking sign that has the universal accessibility symbol that was sometimes missing. There were occasions where the lines were completely faded that would have indicated that it was an accessible space or there was an access aisle next to it. So those were some issues with just making it very unclear whether there was accessible parking, and making it challenging for voters with disabilities to find that. 9 polling locations had inadequate ramps. I believe that some of the observers shared photos of those ramps. Sometimes they would be there would be like 2-track ramps that were not set up properly. That could be a safety issue, or otherwise unsafe ramps. They could be, there were some that had like cracked pavement, were just like a rough surface that would have been very difficult to navigate. 18 polling places had missing or broken curb cuts, excuse me. So again, that's something that would be very challenging and potentially unsafe for people who use mobility devices to be able to navigate, or other people who may have mobility issues. 18 polling sites had obstructed passages. So there were trucks or construction barriers. Sometimes there were objects that were put in the access aisles of parking spaces that made it impossible to be able to get to the curb cut up to the sidewalk. 21 sites had stairs without an adequate ramp. So, if you don't have a ramp and you have stairs, even for just one step, sometimes people will say, oh, there's just one step into the building. That one step still isn't accessible if there isn't a ramp that someone who is using a wheelchair is able to navigate. And then 22 sites had broken pavement and pathways that would have been difficult or potentially impossible for some people with disabilities to be able to navigate. Okay, next slide. So the next category was accessible entrances. So we evaluate sometimes the main entrance for all voters is the accessible entrance, and then sometimes there is a separate accessible entrance. And I do want to note that this doesn't necessarily mean the main entrance to the building. In places like schools, it might be the entrance to a gymnasium. So we're looking at the main entrance for all voters versus if there's a separate entrance that people with disabilities specifically were told to use because it was accessible. So 58 polling sites had inaccessible main entrances, and 36 sites lacked fully accessible separate wheelchair entrances. 26 sites had unmarked accessible entrances. So if voters with disabilities needed to go to a separate accessible entrance, it was not clear in those situations where they needed to go to get to that separate entrance. And it's very important when there is a separate entrance to make sure that that is clearly marked, again, with signage that says it is the accessible entrance that has that universal accessibility symbol, so that people know where to go. And of course, the main entrance to voting should be well marked as well. And that's something that observers came across in a few cases where just the entrance to voting in general was not well marked. 32 polling sites had heavy doors without accessible buttons. We do a lot of analysis of the doors. There are many choices whenever it comes to how observers can mark whether the door is accessible or not. So we look at was the door, was there a button to be able to open the door, or was it propped open? If it was propped open, was it propped open with just like a door stop? Or was it propped open with something like a traffic cone or trash can that a person who's using a wheelchair would not be able to get around? Because in many cases that would be the case, and so that would cause an obstruction. Were the doors too heavy to open if there wasn't a button? And in many cases, there was an accessible button, but it was broken and it wasn't working. So of course that's not accessible. And then 10% of all polling sites had no wheelchair accessible entrance. So that is certainly a concern, because in those cases, just access to the building for someone who's using a mobility device might be impossible, where they just can't get in. There's no accessible alternative. And while I believe Michigan has started to have curbside voting, curbside voting should not be a replacement for being able to access the building. And in many times, it might not be something that's well advertised that voters know about. So something needs to be done about those polling places. I hesitate to assign any kind of hierarchy of what the most significant issues are. But whenever you have a building that there's just no accessible entrance, that is certainly a concern for voters with disabilities, just having potentially no way to get into that building. Next slide. Okay, so next are the voter assist terminal issues. So we looked at how the voter assist terminals were set up, and whether they were set up for privacy. So 17 VATs did not have accessible controllers properly set up. And in one instance, whenever an observer asked about this, a poll worker said that because a VAT was a touch screen, that a controller wasn't necessary. Now, that is not true. Someone who is blind or has low vision is not going to be able to use a touch screen. It doesn't provide non-visual access to them. And so those accessible controllers allow them to be able to navigate that device whenever they're listening to an audio ballot and choose make their choices on their ballot. So that's definitely an issue of poll worker training, and making assumptions about how voters with disabilities use these devices. 71 VATs did not have headphones plugged in and ready. In many cases, the headphones were there, they just weren't plugged in. And then 68 VATs were positioned without voter privacy. So in those cases, a lot of what was seen was there was no, privacy shield around the VAT, so that it was just kind of like people could look at it from all angles. And in many cases, the screen of the VAT was facing towards high traffic areas. So it might be facing towards the line to the table where you sign in to be able to vote, or again, to where people are kind of going throughout the room. And in many cases, this was different from the way that other voting booths were set up for people, where those might have been facing the wall so that, or so that voters had, the privacy of the wall behind them. So that's definitely something to pay attention to. Multiple sites had VATs that were broken, frozen, or unpowered. In those cases, sometimes it was necessary to call election protection hotlines to talk about that and report those issues. There would be error messages on the screen. Again, it was frozen in some cases, or stuck on, like where a poll worker had to, I think, enter a PIN number or something like that. And then some poll workers were using VAT stations as desks or break areas. That is not the proper use of the VAT area. It should be kept clear at all times for voters to be able to use that. People might see that and may, feel discouraged from using the VAT, or feel you know, someone's using that area, so they shouldn't use it. So poll workers definitely should be coached not to use the VAT station for, you know, taking breaks or doing other paperwork or things like that. Next slide. And then, yes, accessibility barriers with the voting booth. And in this case, what we mean is wheelchair height voting booths for people who are hand marking paper ballots. So 42% were inaccessible. 77 sites had improperly set up or missing wheelchair height voting booths. In some cases, poll workers were not aware of what they need that they needed to set up a wheelchair height voting booth. They might have been provided the equipment, but weren't told that it was something that they needed to set up. It was sitting, you know, in another room, and it was just never, you know, something that they made available. In some cases, as it says on the last, I'm skipping ahead here. The poll worker said that the wheelchair users must use the VAT instead. And this kind of came across in two ways, that wheelchair users should be voting on the accessible voting machine, or that they should use the table that the accessible voting machine is on. Now, every voter with a disability should have a choice of whether they want to vote hand marking a paper ballot or using the accessible voting machine. Not all people with disabilities want or need to use accessible voting equipment. And so they should have the same right as everyone else to vote either by hand marking a paper ballot or using the accessible voting equipment. And sometimes voters, or poll workers had this idea that every voter with a disability should be using the accessible voting machine or needs to use that, and that is incorrect. And something, again, easily addressed through training. 122 sites, so 41% of all sites, had accessible voting booths that were positioned without privacy protection. Again, this is something where it can be easily fixed by putting up a privacy shield, making sure that those wheelchair height voting booths are set up in a way that is similar to what the other booths in the room are set up as, providing privacy so that people can't see, you know, how you're voting. Some poll workers claim that they never receive wheelchair users, therefore they don't set up wheelchair height voting booths. This, again, is something that should not be the case. You can't anticipate who is going to vote. You know, even if you've been a poll worker for a very long time, could have new people move into the neighborhood. And also sometimes there are people who need to sit down to vote because they have energy limiting conditions. So they might need to be able to vote sitting down using a chair, just because they don't look like they have a disability doesn't mean that they do not have that. And yes, as I said, others incorrectly stated that wheelchair users must use the accessible voting machine. So as you can see with the last two slides, I don't recall if I said what the actual accessibility percentage was on the last slide for M3. So let me just look here. It was 58%. No, that's early voting here. Eric, can you go back to the last slide? Yes, 42% inaccessible. So you're seeing that a significant number for the voter assist terminal and the voting booth issues, 42% in both cases. Again, these are completely operational barriers. These are not structural issues with the buildings. And so these are things that can be addressed through proper poll worker training. Every issue here should be something that election officials are addressing, of course, especially, you know, whenever people can't get into the building to be able to vote. But these can be very quickly and easily and through pretty low or no cost, just addressed through poll worker training and making sure that people know, you know, how to properly assist people with disabilities, voters with disabilities, that, not everyone who has a disability looks like they have a disability. There are invisible and non-apparent disabilities, and just proper etiquette around assisting and supporting voters and voters with disabilities. Okay, slide. So we took a look at accessibility by facility type to see, are there certain types of buildings that are more accessible than others? One of the challenges with this is obviously whenever it comes to the types of buildings that are used, certain buildings are used more than others. So as you'll see on here, 133 of the sites were public schools, 91 were places of worship, and 31 were community centers. And so you have a bigger sample size for all of those than, say, colleges and universities, which there were only 3 of them that were used, and those were 2/3 of those were fully accessible. So it's a little challenging to do direct comparisons just because you can't really compare the percentage of accessibility for 3 sites to 133 sites. But it is very interesting that of the sites of public schools, only 7% of public schools were fully accessible. And public schools are required by the Americans with Disabilities Act to be accessible year round for people with disabilities, versus places of worship, which, as I said, they are exempt from the ADA usually, were 12% accessible. In terms of just generally what we saw, colleges and universities, 67% were accessible. Retirement homes, 4 of those were visited, half of those were accessible. And then you kind of got into, lower numbers for community centers. Of the 31 of those, 29% were accessible. Government buildings, so that was usually like city halls or city government offices, 28% accessible. Apartment buildings, 14%, and then places of worship and public schools, so 12 and 7% respectively. And then other facilities, so there were firehouses, libraries, there were just a number of other types of buildings. Those had some pretty significant accessibility barriers. Next slide. So, as I said, we looked at building accessibility policies outside of Election Day. So again, on Election Day, polling places are required to be accessible, but these buildings year-round have different accessibility policies. And the ones that we were looking at were ADA Title II, which applies to government buildings, applies to public schools. These are places that are regularly required to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act, probably to the greatest extent. ADA Title III, which is places of public accommodations. Usually those are things like, I can't remember what building types those fell under, but those are usually privately owned places that have to comply with some parts of the ADA. Then Fair Housing Act, so apartment buildings would fall under the Fair Housing Act. And then places that were exempt were churches and religious schools. So 61% of buildings fall under ADA Title II requirements. So these are, again, government buildings. Oh yes, Title III, a YMCA. So like nonprofits, if nonprofits, I think, because there were very few that fell under Title III, if I recall. But a YMCA, a nonprofit, I think Boys and Girls Club, there were a couple Boys and Girls Clubs that were used as polling places. Sorry about that. So 180 sites, 61% fall under ADA Title II requirements. So again, this is like city halls and public schools. 93 sites, 32%, were exempt as places of worship, and they still require temporary modifications on election day. The building accessibility correlates with overall voting accessibility, and even ADA Title II buildings, as you saw on the last slide, schools and libraries, they often had barriers. Pulling up the numbers here, looking at the accessibility of buildings, I just kind of isolated the data for the exterior of the building. So the parking and pathway, and then the entrances. And of those ADA Title II buildings, only 13%, let me make sure that's the correct one I'm looking at here. No, it's not. So looking at those ADA Title II, 36% were fully accessible, falling under ADA Title II. And 30% of exempt buildings were fully accessible. So we had very similar levels for buildings that are regularly required to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act and buildings that are exempt from the ADA. And I don't know how to feel about that. That could mean that, you know, you're choosing exempt buildings that are on average the same as, you know, public schools, things like that. But our public schools, our libraries, our city halls should be complying with accessibility standards. And the fact that only around 30% of them are means that these barriers are impacting these buildings, are impacting people with disabilities, both on election day and likely, you know, when they're going to school, when they're going to city hall. So there's a lot of room for improvement there, both on and off election day. Next slide. Yes, and then just comparing 2022 and 2024 data. So this is looking at the sites that were visited both in 2022 and 2024. There were 242 that were visited both times. So for accessible parking and pathway, it dropped by 21 percentage points. So that shows that the exterior of the building, the parking and pathway, kind of gained a lot of challenges between those 2 years. Maybe the parking lots have degraded and the sidewalks have degraded. So, you know, there's a lot of exterior challenges there. Accessible entrances, they increased by 14%. Accessible VAT actually went up by 17%, the greatest jump. So that shows an improvement in poll worker training. But accessible voting booths went down by 6%. So there's kind of a mix there where 2 of those measures have improved for those polling places and then 2 have gone down. But in general, 15% of those sites were accessible in 2022 and 9% were accessible in 2024. So overall accessibility decreased for those sites that were visited again. And I think this data is really helpful, you know, as DDP continues to do these observations, they'll get more of an idea of, you know, year over year, how is the accessibility overall improving or decreasing, and how's the accessibility of certain sites? Is it getting better or worse? Next slide. And I'm going to hand it over to Eric for third-party data.
Thank you, Sarah. This is Eric. So yeah, just want to touch real closely. In addition to the audits that were conducted by DDP's auditors, we also had 2 organizations, the School of Social Work at U of M and the ACLU of Michigan, actually had some volunteers that conducted some audits in some other areas in the Ann Arbor area and in the like Bay City, Saginaw, Midland area of the state. And so we just separated the data out because their training was a little bit different than our regular auditors. But they did visit 73 sites during the general election. They found 16% to be fully accessible. 31 of the sites, or 42%, had just one access barrier. And if corrected, full accessible sites would be 59%. Again, though, this, where the communities we audited, we hit every site. We didn't necessarily get full coverage in these areas, so the data, is a little bit different. But we did want to share and appreciate the work of these volunteers, and they're helping us figure out how we can expand this program to more communities in a way that gets us results, so that we can work with more clerks in the future. In addition, we also had some data shared with us from voters, in particular from the Election Protection Hotline, the 866-R vote, and then also Michigan Voices, their partners had a reporting mechanism. So they shared their data with us, and we were able to pull out the disability related items that they found. The Election Protection Hotline had 37 accessibility related calls, and the Michigan Voices partners reported 21 accessibility barriers. The most common things they found were vehicles blocking accessible entrances. So this could be, vehicles parked in the access lane so people can't get to the curb cut, and things like that. Issues with the VATs, missing wheelchair height voting booths, and inadequate signage and wayfinding. So really what they found aligned with much of what our DDP auditors found. And one report did talk about poll workers physically carrying a wheelchair user due to an inaccessible entrance. And it should be noted that these reports were coming in from across the state, since they had both Michigan Voices and the Election Protection Hotline operate across. So this wasn't just in Metro Detroit, but definitely some very, very concerning things. So with that, I do want to pass it to Kenya, so she can talk a little bit about the administrative challenges and key recommendations.
Thank you, Eric. This is Kenya speaking. So like Eric said, I will talk about some of the administrative challenges that we feel contribute to some of the accessibility challenges in Michigan. So Michigan has a very decentralized system, and so most it is the most decentralized election system in the country, because it spans 83 counties, 280 cities, and 1,240 townships. So that equates to 1,603 clerks that administer elections, which is a lot of clerks. Over 15% of all election jurisdiction in the United States is in Michigan, which is a pretty significant number. There are also resource limitations. Local clerks are responsible for polling place compliance. Lack of funding for accessibility modifications, limited budget for capital improvement projects, insufficient understanding of accessibility requirements, facilities that are used only a few times a year, as polling locations also contributes to some of the challenges. So next we're going to go into the key recommendations based on the 2024 data in the report. So our first recommendation is to increase coordination between jurisdictions and the state to provide necessary resources. We suggest clearly labeling all pathways at polling locations and removing obstruction. So as Sarah pointed out earlier, a lot of places didn't have, adequate signage letting people know exactly where to go for the accessible entrances. Ensure poll workers receive training on the voter assist terminals, VATs, and wheelchair height voting booths. A lot of times people didn't know how to properly set them up. And so that was a really big problem. The voter shouldn't have to wait hours for that to happen or for them to remedy any issues that arise. We recommend standardizing training to address inconsistencies in election day administration, providing funding to local, county, and city clerks to meet accessibility requirements. We understand that, finances can be tricky. And so we know how important being able to fund those projects are for the clerks. We recommend increasing Michigan Secretary of State support to clerks for improving compliance. And then we've broken down our recommendations for state entities and local clerks to sort of help, emphasize what is within whose jurisdiction. So for state entities, we recommend allocating sufficient funds to support county and city clerks, funding statewide accessibility audits. So as we mentioned, we primarily focused on Metro Detroit, aside from our partners focusing on a small portion of other areas, but we understand that accessibility isn't just a problem in Metro Detroit. It's a Michigan problem, but it's also a nationwide problem. And so we would love to have more comprehensive data of what that looks like across the state. We also recommend providing enhanced training and guidance to municipalities, standardized poll worker accessibility training statewide. And then for municipalities, we recommend focusing on structural improvements. So that includes repairing sidewalks and ramps, widening doorways where possible, fixing malfunctioning door openers and elevators. That was one of our biggest problems that we encountered. And as we mentioned, if you're, using this facility for other purposes, like 98% of the time, that is also an issue for whatever activities are happening during that time. And then for local clerks, we recommend that they enhance poll worker training on VAT setup and operation, wheelchair height, voting booth placement, internal accessibility pathway management, conducting practice elections using accessible voting equipment to make sure that the poll workers fully understand how to operate the VAT. So moving forward, what does the implementation of this strategy look like? So first, we want to immediately address needs. So that means focusing on locations that had one single barrier because it's the first and quickest improvement that can be made. And especially if it includes, something as easy as making sure that the VAT has a controller available or headphones plugged in. That's such a simple fix that costs nothing to do. We recommend distributing detailed accessibility reports to each, or we will distribute detailed accessibility reports to each jurisdiction. So what that means is we will share the specific data with each clerk for their polling places and what the barriers there were, as well as what they can do to remedy those barriers. Provide training materials for poll workers on VATs and accessibility, excuse me. Create accessibility kits with temporary solutions for common barriers. After the 2022 report, one of the things we did was create one-pagers of free and low cost modifications that can be made. And so we're happy to share those with anybody who is interested in them. And then for our long-term advocacy, we want to pursue dedicated funding sources for accessibility improvements, strengthen coordination between the Secretary of State and local clerks, engage the disability community in accessibility planning and oversight, and track improvement over time through continued audits. And I will now turn it back over to Eric to help wrap us up.
Thank you, Kenya. This is Eric. And I do before we're going to hop into some time for questions and comments. Before I do want to touch on any clerks on the line can expect that if your jurisdiction was included in the report, within probably the next 48 hours, you'll get an email from us, which will include the report, but also your specific data broken out so that you can review that. And then, we can be available to support or find solutions or anything like that. But you expect that from us within the next 48 hours. But with that, we will move to any questions that anyone has. The data is out there. It's actually up on our website. The report, actually both the 2020 for data report and the audit report we released following the 2022 elections, as well as this year we did release the data set. It can be found on the website as well for our data nerds out there. And we're going to be working to actually get the 2022 data up there as well. This slide presentation will go up there, and then we'll be working. It'll probably take us a few days to get the presentation or this recording available and out there. So give us a little bit of time on that. But the other, the report and the data set are there and available and can be shared. We've shared it broadly, with obviously the clerks that were included, but also with, state legislators, leaders of municipal governments and others to make sure that they have the information as we're talking about these number of things. So yeah, share it broadly. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate your time. Again, you have questions, clerks, you will be hearing from us or reach out to us. We really want to work with you and working with other partners that are also doing clerk engagement work to make sure they're looped in on this so that they can provide support as well. Because if 1,600 clerks call me, I guarantee I won't be able to get to all of you. So we are asking our partners support, but reach out. We really want to work with you on this. So thank you so much.